I would like to invite Aaron from 139 Consulting to the table here, and from that, take it away.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know what else to say on that one.
With this time, good afternoon. Amy tells me that this is a very nice crowd, so thank you all for coming out to stoke my ego and let me talk to the people. I appreciate it. My name is Aaron Marks. I am the founder and principal consultant for 139 Consulting. We work primarily in risk, crisis, and consequence. I have a lot of people go, oh, you're a disaster guy. No, I work in disruption. And the reason I talk about disruption instead of disaster is because disruption can come from positive things as well as negative. So everybody has thought about, okay, what if there's an earthquake? What if there's a derecho that comes through? What if there's a tornado? But part of the discussions I like to have with groups, especially with nonprofits, is have you thought about what happens if all of a sudden you have an angel donor who gives you $1 million? Or if all of a sudden you have a huge PR campaign just kind of get dropped in your lap? You know, what happens if all of a sudden one of your social media posts goes viral and you now have a national or international footprint to step into? All of those things are, it's what we dream about for our organizations, but they can be incredibly disruptive, and if you're not ready for them, they can challenge or break your organizations. So when I talk about risk, when I talk about crisis and consequence, I always want to remind people that positive can have sharp edges, just like the negative. So a little of my background, I've got 18 years as the term of love as a slimy government contractor. I did work inside the Beltway. I've worked all over the world, the US government. I worked for the European Union, the United Nations, NATO, and several independent nations, kingdoms, and principalities, all talking about risk and crisis, and then how do we manage the consequences when things go sideways. I started out as a paramedic in the mid-'80s. I've worked all over the country, and the reason I got into where I am now is because I was dissatisfied with the way bigger incidents were managed. My first big response was 1995 to Oklahoma City for the World Federal Building bombing. But my epiphany was in 2005 when I deployed down for Katrina and Rita on the Gulf Coast. And I came back very, very disillusioned with emergency management. Not the dealing with life threats we can do. Dealing with the bigger challenges, I was not happy with how it went. And my lovely wife, after listening to me whine for a while, told me if I was going to complain about something so much, I better be willing to put skin in the game and try and fix it and make it better. And that's why I started doing things like this. Is my entire goal is to try and make things better. Make it easier for you as the leaders of your organizations to make sure that your doors can open again the day after something goes sideways. So what I want to do is go around the room and have each of you introduce yourselves, just your name, the organization you're with, and then how well. Okay, so we come from a very, very diverse and broad spectrum of organizations, and just as broad spectrum of experience and expertise. What we're going to talk about today is a very high-level concept of risk and risk management. What I heard interest in from the group are two different types or two different approaches. One being a macro approach, looking at risk management for your organization. And then the other one being a micro approach, focusing on risk management for individual events or occurrences. And you need both. Even if you think you never sponsor events, even if you're not dependent on events for your revenue stream, you still have activities where you bring groups of people together, either virtually or in a single place. And as the responsible partner or responsible party, your organization has a duty of care. You have a duty to consider the risks for all of your activities and then to actively manage those risks. And on the commercial side, this is where I usually segue into OSHA and their general duty clause, where there's an expectation by statute for employers to provide a safe workplace. And OSHA has changed their interpretation of that to where they are now, in their investigations, speaking to employees and saying, do you feel safe at work? The answer is no for any reason, whether it's because of bullying and harassment, whether it's because of physical risk, or just an emotionally charged topic that triggers a more in-depth investigation. And in cases of healthcare, OSHA's now writing fines for healthcare facilities where their staff say we don't feel safe at work. So there are teeth to it. It may not directly impact your organizations, but if you leave the United States, if you go to Canada right now, their occupational safety laws impact their nonprofits. They aren't immune. And their requirements for safety are even more intense than ours. And Canada's laws are about to be enacted as the global standard, as the world standard, which of course in America as individualists, we refuse to acknowledge and we don't sign on. But it's still out there, so if you have an international footprint, odds are you're gonna run into that. So risk management matters because we live in a complex world. Everything is unstable right now. There are a lot of people who are using the buzzword that we are in a time of polycrisis, where we're just going from one crisis till the next, till the next, till the next, and we don't get a chance to take a breath. We don't get a chance to adapt. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that we are definitely in a time of instability and we're in a time of radical change. I was having a discussion with a colleague yesterday who said today's newspapers read like we're back in 1967, where we have this massive social upheaval that's going on. We're seeing a lot of individuals and organizations that are moving towards conflict as a resolution strategy instead of conversation. And the world is evolving faster than we can handle. As a resident dinosaur, you know, I've been known to sit and scream at the sky as the asteroid comes down. We can't do that. We need to take the mindset to recognize the asteroid and to do what we can to make it a survivable incident instead of an organizational ending incident. Because bad things are gonna happen. Good things are gonna happen. Disruption is what you need to grow and to live. Risk management, at least the way that I look at it, is being ready to manage the change. Being ready to make ourselves and our organizations resilient from the fact that we can take advantage of the opportunities that are presented in disruption. Because, you know, when you go to talk to it, when you look at your organization, go, we've always done it this way, that's like a red flag for me. Because that means if I come in and find a strategy to break this way, your organization will stop. So we're gonna talk about how that plays in, but in order to make it work, we're also gonna talk about some definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we all understand the conversation. The first one is, what is a hazard? And the problem with general language in my world is people look at threats and hazards and they think they're the same thing, and they treat them the same. And there's a big difference. A hazard is something that can create or cause harm in and of itself. It doesn't need any help, it doesn't need a human in the loop. So hazards are things like the weather and like earthquakes. Hazards are also things like hazardous materials, machinery, infrastructure. Things that if you don't pay attention to them will bite you. Then there's threats. And the big difference between a hazard and a threat is a threat requires intent. A threat is an active behavior, or it's an active element. There's context development, and for a threat to exist, there has to be a hazard first. And then there has to be a vulnerability. That hazard has to be able to hurt you. Then somebody or something needs to come into play and take that hazard and make it real. So there may be a severe weather hazard that exists. That's just a constant in our lives. A severe weather threat exists when you hold an event, an outside event, and there is a forecast for severe weather and you ignore it. You now have an active threat from that weather, from that hazard, to interact with your organization. So the hazard is just, it's there, the world exists. The threat is where your organization interacts with a hazard. There's vulnerability. So we've established that there are things that are out there that can hurt us, that can hurt you, hurt your organization, or maybe help your organization in such a way that it's disruptive and it causes unintentional harm. Vulnerability is, can it hurt you? So generic statement. I can make a generic statement that weather is a hazard and that there is a forecast of severe weather that makes it an active threat. Vulnerability is, am I outside? Am I under sea level? Am I in a depression where it can flood? Am I above a tree line where the wind can hurt me? So yes, it exists, but can it hurt you? Can it? And that's your vulnerability element. And they can be physical, they can be operational, but there's also financial. So you've got direct and indirect vulnerability that you need to think about. And then when you take hazard and threat and vulnerability and combine it, you come up with risk. And risk is the intersection of a hazard or a threat with the vulnerability. So does it exist? Can it hurt you? And then probability. How likely is it to happen? And then there's an additional element that I add to risk conversations, and that's, do you care? I mean, there are a lot of places where people look at risks and say it's too much, we can't deal with it, so they ignore it. The Key Bridge in Baltimore is a primary example of that. There was a hazard, big ships moving through limited water, and we have construction in the middle of it. It became a threat when a cargo ship pulled away from the dock and then lost power and lost steering. The vulnerability is that that bridge was designed in the 70s for much smaller ships at much lower speeds. So that all combines to be significant risk. Baltimore looked at that risk and said it's too expensive. So they chose to not care. They chose to prioritize other elements. So as an organization, you want to sit and look at your environment, look at the world around you. Can it hurt you? Does it exist with sharp edges? Are you vulnerable to it? Can those sharp edges get to you? How probable is that to happen? And then, do you care? Where are your priorities? Where can you invest your time and attention? Because I don't think there's anybody in that room, and if this is not a true statement, let me know, because I want to come be your best friend, that has unlimited resources. Whether it's financial, whether it's time and attention, whether it's people. So we all have to balance that piece, and that's your active element in risk management. So when we put it all together, how many of you have seen a risk matrix before? Bright colors, pretty pictures. This is the best way to communicate with a donor or with a C-suite because they don't have to read words. The problem with this is it's too general. This can give you your basic understanding. You can do really basic qualifications, high, medium, low, critical. But like I said, this doesn't take into consideration, do you care? It doesn't take into consideration the other things you have to think about to bring into your risk calculus. And I call it calculus because calculus makes my brain hurt. It's not simple math. You're dealing with theory, you're dealing with possibility. This is a good place to start. And any good risk manager will start you with this matrix, but it will very quickly turn into something that looks to what I call a spaghetti chart. It looks like just somebody took a bunch of different colored lines and put it on a plate and said, this is your risk environment. So risk is not simple. Risk is not easy, but it's something that we all have to think about because we have a duty of care. We have a duty to our organizations to keep our organizations functional. We have a duty to the people around us to take care of them. And you can look at that as a human duty, which is the way that I look at it. You can look at it as a regulatory duty because of OSHA and other rules and regulations. You also can look at it as a risk-based duty because there is now a growing case of civil statute, civil precedent for individuals and organizations, including nonprofits, to be held accountable for injury or disruption at events or occurrences. So I had somebody a couple weeks ago come up and say, "You're just like a character in The Sopranos." I asked him why. And he said, "It's because you came up to me, you were really polite." He said, "That's an awfully nice organization you have there." And then you put your arm over my shoulder and said, "It'd be awfully bad if something terrible should happen to her." Not what I want to do. I am not here to intimidate or scare or pressure anyone. Our mission at 139 and my mission in this work is to help people be ready to manage the risk and to find the positives on the other side. To see the opportunities that come from looking at these challenges and take advantage of them to grow you as individuals, to grow your organizations through. So when we talk about risk and hazards and threats, people usually choose one aspect that they like, that they're comfortable with, that they understand. And right now, if you look at the mainstream media, everybody is focused on cyber and digital risk. Everybody's focused on IT, on the electronics. What we're forgetting are the other pieces. We're not talking as much about physical risk for the main part. There are some exceptions. And we're absolutely not talking about brand or reputational risk in public. There may be discussions going on behind closed doors. Everybody gets really, really nervous and antsy when I start talking about brand and reputation, because you can't see it. You can't touch it, you can't smell it, and by the time you break it, you're not gonna know until it's too late. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about each one of these three, and then we're gonna talk about the convergence, which is your holistic or your enterprise risk management. So when we talk about the physical, natural hazards, these are the things that exist in nature. And if you ever come see me speak again about natural hazards, you're gonna hear me always say that Mother Nature is the ultimate serial killer. Nature will always find a way to challenge us, to force us to be uncomfortable, to make us grow, and if we don't, nature will break us. We've got technological hazards: power, water, communications, hazardous materials, chemicals. We call it TIC and TIM, toxic industrial chemicals, toxic industrial materials. How many of you have cell phones? How many of you remember a couple weeks ago when our big national network providers all went down at the same time? And I'm not looking at T-Mobile.
No, ours didn't actually.
That is true, because I'm a team, that's right. One of the only ones that did. I know.
So our dependency on technology is a great enabler. It's a wonderful tool until it stops working. That's why you'll see me walk around with my computer and my phone and all the electronics. But in my briefcase, I've got 3 legal pads and 4 notebooks, and everything goes on paper. Because I've learned not to trust technology. It's a great enabler. But think about your records. How much of your records, of what you use to operate every day, is all electrons? How many of you have paper copies of your important documents? A couple hands go up. Something to think about. And then there's human-centric hazards. Criminal activity, terrorist activity, active shooter, active assailant. There are a couple schools I know that you guys are talking about, the school shootings. I hope that some of you in this room are watching what's going on college campuses right now very closely. Hasn't happened in Virginia yet, but the groups are organizing, and it will be in Virginia relatively soon. For those of you that are doing outside events, community events, anything you do that advertises, that has the potential of a lot of media or community attention, can become a target for activist organizations. So you have to think about what would you do if protesters from any side, from any topic, what would happen if the Wayland Baptist Church showed up? What would happen if the pro-Gaza, the Gaza-Israeli protesters showed up? Sir?
I'm actually okay with protesters running out of bulls for the rodeo. So
See,
they would add to the evening, so.
It's in lieu of the clowns, right, John?
Yeah, having grown up in Texas, I can commiserate. And we have to think about, okay, how can human behavior come in and cause you headaches? And it may not be a physical threat, but it's absolutely a risk for your branding, your reputation, what you tolerate, how you interact. Think about, look at any news network, any channel out there. Stories they're about the protesters, but it's also about how the authorities are interacting with the protesters. If it's your event, you're the authorities. So you need to think about those elements. When you're thinking about those physical pieces, you want to think about engineering controls. What can you put in place to help protect you or to help limit or remove that risk? This is your fire extinguishers. This is access control, locking doors or having somebody at the doors to control who comes in and out. This is pushing your greeters out into the parking lot, out before you hit your hard perimeter, so that you can identify risks before they get to that door and talk through it. Big question is, how do you respond? Evacuate or shelter in a tornado or in a fire. Lots of argument, and I can use the word, lots of arguments right now in the school security community about if there's a shooter, is run, hide, fight still correct? Because, do you barricade in a room or do you try to escape? Lots of very aggressive debate over that part for the schools right now. If you're going to evacuate, do you just tell everybody to scatter and run? Or do you have muster points? Because if you ask me, if you say to evacuate, you still have responsibility for the people who were in your space. So I'm always gonna tell you to have a muster point, have some sort of accountability strategy. Have some strategy in place to reconnect people, students with their parents, patients with their families, especially if you're dealing with a community that does not have the capacity to make their own decisions. You're responsible for them. Lots of things to think about. If you decide to shelter, so if I told you there is a hazardous materials release in the parking lot outside of the library, and we need to shelter in place, what would that look like? Is it just closing and locking the doors? Is it having 10 mil polypropylene sheets so you can actually seal the doors and make them airtight? Questions about, okay, we sealed the doors to protect the people inside. What happens if there's a pregnant mother right outside the door begging to come in? Do you break the seals and let them in and put everybody inside the library at risk? Or do you leave the door sealed and tell her, I'm sorry, the risk is too great, we can't breach? Lots of really interesting conversations. Conversations in hospitals where they go, okay, we're gonna seal the doors. And I look at them and go, okay, is your security armed? And if they say yes, how far, what are their rules for use of force? How far are you willing to go to protect that perimeter? That is an extreme example, an extreme case, but it's something to think about. If you have decided to shelter and you're sheltering from something where opening the doors makes it much worse, how far are you willing to go to protect the perimeter? Safety and security. Do you have security personnel? Are they armed or unarmed? How are they trained? What are their policies on use of force? What are their policies on escalation and de-escalation? Lots of things to think about there. Communication, how do you talk about this? How do you talk to your people inside your organization? But even more so, how do you talk to people outside your organization? So that they understand that you're managing the risk, that they understand that you're paying attention and that you're engaged. And this is a big sticking point. I work with several schools and they look at me and go, we need to keep our plans secret. Because if anybody knows our plans, then they're gonna use it against us. They're gonna find a weakness and get away around it. My response to that is, that's nice, but what happens if the kids in your school don't know what the plan is? The teacher's gonna help. So, Culpeper Public Schools, average class size is somewhere between 24 and 30 students per teacher. How well do you think that teacher's gonna maintain control and be able to educate if something goes wrong, if the kids get excited or the kids get paid? You have to communicate your plans and programs. You have to communicate how you're managing risk. Yes, there is the possibility of somebody taking advantage of that and using it against you. However, historically speaking, looking at almost 60 years of research, publishing your plans has more of a defensive value. It lets people who would harm your organization know that you're aware and you're paying attention and that you've got something to, you've got a plan to deal with. You're not necessarily a soft target or you're an easy mark. And that, statistically, that outweighs any enhancement of risk of people trying to figure out how to break your plan. And then continuity. How are you going to keep your doors open if something disruptive happens? How are we, I worked with a basketball team, national basketball team in Oklahoma City. And went and did some planning and worked with them. And the owners of the team said, if there's ever an active assailant incident in this arena, we're never going to play another game here. We will never come back because we can never overcome the reputation, the loss of trust. The city of Oklahoma City, who happened to own that facility, their eyes got really, really big because they had never considered that their only tenant would never come back. Think about you guys, a couple of you mentioned the challenges with COVID. How many members would you lose if there was an act of violence at one of your events? How would you convince your members that it was safe for them to come back? How would you convince the public that it was safe for them to come in and participate with your organization? That's all part of your considerations around physical risk. When we talk about brand and reputational risk, this is the bugaboo. This is the boogeyman, because it's so hard to get your hands around it, because nobody really wants to talk about it because it makes people uncomfortable. Public scandals. You don't have to, turn 3 pages into a newspaper these days, or 3 clicks into your search engine of choice before you see a public scandal. Embezzlement, harassment, racism, discrimination. It's out there. People are watching us, always. Social media controversies. I had a meeting with a company last week who was in a panic because one of their employees made an unauthorized post on X that said, "My company stands with Israel." Very, very polarizing statement right now, no matter which side of the crisis you're on. This person made a public statement on an international platform, unauthorized by the company, but their presence on X is directly associated with their organization. So exposure by association. They wanted to know, okay, how do we manage this? And my first question was, okay, how many retweets or reclicks has their post got? Has it gone viral? Is it getting much attention? And the answer was it's only been echoed about 100 times. So I told them, ignore it. Be aware, don't respond. But you have to, how many of you monitor social media? How many of you have a formal social media presence and anybody from your organization can use it? Lots of things to think about with that exposure. Allegations and accusations. It doesn't have to be true for it to hurt you. And mainstream media are infamous for this. Well, they will make an incorrect statement. They will parrot an accusation, and it will cause immense disruption to your reputation. And 24 hours later, something will come up that will prove that it's not true. And maybe 3 or 4 days from now, if it's online or video, they might make a retraction. If it's the newspaper, they will have put their headline, "Bad things happened," 48-point font across the front, and they'll put their retraction on page 27 in 6-point font. So you have to be aware of the potential for allegations and accusations. You have to manage your reputation to make it ironclad so that you can challenge this. And today's environment, where we are drowning in data and we are starving for wisdom, it's all out there. And people aren't considering, is it true or not? If you can make an emotional hook with the statement, then it becomes true for some people, no matter what the actual facts are. So when you talk about your brand and reputational elements, you wanna think about indirect controls. How can you enhance your brand and your reputation and strengthen it so that it can't be questioned? How do you make yourself a positive presence in the community so that if somebody makes an accusation, that the community at least gives you a chance to refute it instead of just all dogpiling on you? Crisis communication strategies. This is, you have to be ready to respond. You have to be ready to say something. You can't leave a vacuum. Because if you don't put information out, people make up their own stories. As a first responder, as a responder at these large scale, massive events, I watched this play out over and over and over again. The media would show up and say, hey, we wanna know what's going on. People in charge were saying, we're busy, we'll get back to you. And before they got back to them, they'll be all over the television or all over Facebook or social media or anything, interviews with people on the street who have no idea what's going on, but they're gonna say whatever sounds good. And it can cause significant incidents. So you need to have a plan in place to deal with those communications, somebody who is trained and ready to talk to the media, to talk to the public, and say what's going on. Stakeholder engagements. Is there anybody in the room who has not done a stakeholder mapping exercise? Figure out who your stakeholders are, who is important to you. That can be students, that can be clients, customers, it can be parents and caregivers, it can be broader elements of the community, but you wanna figure out whose opinion do you care about? Because I guarantee you there are components of our neighborhoods, components of our culture, of our society, that your organizations don't care about. You don't care if they get upset. You don't care if they start making noise because you're focused somewhere else. You need to figure out who you do care about. And then you need to identify those other areas so that you can manage anything that comes out of there. And then media training. How many of y'all have done interviews with the media? Print, radio, television, internet, hands go up. How many of you think that that would have gone smoothly if you hadn't prepared for it? So if you are in a friendly experience with the media, usually they'll work with you and they'll give you a chance to think and they'll give you a chance to come up with a message. If you were talking to the media after a disruption, after something bad happens, they're pushing hard and fast. They are waiting for you to make a misstatement or make a mistake. They are waiting for you to give them something that will make their interview special so they can get those clicks, so they can get that in there. Media training is something you should at least have one person in your organization go through so you know how to talk to the media, especially under stress. Like I said, if it's a friendly interview, then you can work through it. If you're under stress, it's not gonna be a friendly interview, even if they have a smile on their face. Cyber and digital hazards and threats. This is on the top of almost everybody's list. Malware, ransomware, spyware, and viruses. United Healthcare, one of their subsidiaries got nailed with ransomware. Reports are, they paid a $20 million ransom. And then 3 weeks later, that first ransomware gang sold their data to another gang, and they're now being extorted for another $4 million, at least, with threats of releasing sensitive information onto the dark web. Not just keeping them from being able to access it, it's threats of that release. They are being excoriated by the government right now, by the regulators, by the risk management and the cybersecurity community, going nuts over this whole situation. And they made decisions that they thought were the best ones they could at the time. Spyware and viruses. How many of you deal with sensitive information for your clients or partners? And how many of you keep that in electrons or worst case scenario, keep it in the cloud? All things you need to think about. You know, Amazon Web Services will tell you that they are 99.99% secure. While that 0.01% is what's important. So you have to, you can't trust anybody to keep you safe. You have to actively keep yourself safe with this. Data breach, unauthorized access and exposure. How many of you have members of your organization, employees or not, who have access to that sensitive data? How many of you are absolutely 100% sure that those individuals are happy and don't have any type of grievance or bone to pick with your organization? So everyone, for data breach, everybody talks about the outside threats, the nation state, the criminals, people trying to hack in. You can't forget insider threats. You can't forget about that disgruntled employee or that disgruntled member who may have a password, who may have access to your systems. And then social engineering. This young lady said that she's studying AI because it scares her and she wants to understand it. So there was a case that was announced, I think earlier this week in Maryland, where a disgruntled employee at a school went to OpenAI and said, here's a voice sample, make me a recording of this individual making obscene and racist and discriminatory statements. Made the recording, released it to the school board, and got this individual fired. Late last month, they caught this individual at a TSA checkpoint with a gun, and it started an entire investigation. And they found evidence that this person made an audio deepfake, released it to the school district. The school district said, we don't want to deal with this if it goes public, so they fired the principal. They're doing cyber kidnapping now. There was a case that was publicized out of California where a gang from China went after a Chinese international student and sent a video deep fake of this student's parents who said, okay, you need to go camping, and if we see you in 6 weeks, we're gonna disown you. And then when the kid dropped off the grid, they sent a deep fake to the kid's parents and said, we now have your child, pay a ransom or else. All video. Please.
Before you get off the slide, something happened to us back in December, and that was that somebody broke into our bank account through fraudulent means, and a lot of things you're talking about may seem far-fetched to some of us, but I'm here to tell you that this happened to us. Somebody called, they were, I think the word is spoofing the phone number from the bank that you call if you're having a problem. And they were able to convince one of our volunteers that somebody was using our credit card down in Texas somewhere to buy whatever. And through all of that, they were able to get into our bank account, and they wire transferred money out. And then when that wasn't enough money, they actually wired money from one of our accounts to the other account, and then to their bank, which happened to be the same bank that we use. Not sure how that works, but and we didn't get the money back. It was several $1,000s. We got a few $1,000s back, but so this is a very real thing. And if you think that your bank is going to reimburse you that money, they are not. The very first thing that the bank manager said to me was, "I hope you have insurance." And it's like we were just floored, stunned, because we just thought that the bank would help us with that, would take care of it, and they don't. So it's a little off your topic, but it's such a real thing that could happen.
What would even be insurance on your money in the bank look like?
What exactly? Well, wait a minute. Yeah, exactly. What would that look like?
It's a revenue. It's a business policy based on lost revenue.
No.
But as far as the bank is concerned, it was a valid transaction because they had all of the account numbers, all of the passwords, and they were able to do the process.
Yeah.
It's your responsibility to protect your
Right.
sensitive
They didn't
information.
even have our passwords. They just had our email and a couple of other things. We were still able to do it. We had never ever wired any money from the account ever, and they just, it's just too bad, so sad. So Anyway, that was a lesson
So
learned.
it's probably a good idea for you to sit
Yeah.
down with your bankers and go, what are your policies?
Yeah.
What are the practices in place? I had a discussion yesterday with a coworker from a company that I used to work at. They brought on a summer intern. They're a very sharp young lady, you know, very, very smart, very, you know, go-getter, you know, aggressive. They announced on social media that she had gotten an internship with the company. Less than 24 hours later, she got a text message that was spoofed to the number of one of the owners of the company named John. And it said, hey, it's John, I need you to go pick up some gift cards for me so that we can give out some awards to other employees, and once you bring them in, you can file the expense report and you'll get reimbursed for it. So she saw that, and she got all excited that one of the owners was going, okay, it's her very first day as an intern. One of the owners, number one, knew who she was, and then number two, was willing to trust her with something like this. And she went and bought the gift cards, and went back to the office and talked to the office manager and said, hey, when's John in again? I've got the gift cards for him. At which point the office manager sat her down and explained, no, you know, it wasn't from, you got spoofed, you got jammed up. And the problem is the company where she's at works in some very sensitive Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security contracts, and they had to let her go. They had to cancel her internship because she just demonstrated that she was a security risk. So there are people watching you all the time. There are people trying to take advantage of you. You have to be aware of it. So when you think about cyber and digital, and the difference between cybersecurity and digital security doesn't involve people. Digital security is just your data, whether it's encrypted, whether it's backed up. Cybersecurity is somebody being able to access your data. It's the human in the loop to get to you. Everybody talks about cybersecurity, not too many people are talking about digital. But that, you know, cybersecurity and digital security, do you have firewalls? Do you require complex passwords? Do you require those passwords to be changed on a regular basis? That we all love, because, you know, we've got all this mess around it. You know, have you tested your cybersecurity? Have you had an outside agent come in and attempt to penetrate into your systems? Do you do phishing drills where you send emails to people and see if you can convince them to click on a link? Drives me crazy. I get a couple of them a week. You know, incident response. Have you thought about what happens when your bank calls you and says your money's gone? What happens if somebody takes control of your website and either locks it out or changes it, puts up offensive materials? You have to think about how are you going to respond to that. Do you have the resources to deal with a cyber attack? Or are you just going to figure it out if it happens? And then training. You have to talk to your people about this. You have to explain why they have to change their passwords. You have to explain why you don't want them to write it down and keep it on a Post-it note next to their computer. You have to train people so they understand the risk. They understand what you're doing to manage the risk and why it's making their life more difficult in order to protect the organization. Please.
So we had this conversation just about having, like, all the programs were associated with URL, password, login, all that information. Where would you recommend that be stored?
So my recommendation is that you use a password manager. Now the challenge with that is they all live in the cloud, which means they're vulnerable. LastPass, which used to be the #1 password manager for corporate in the United States, got hacked 2 months ago, and their market share dropped by 45%. So there is no perfect solution. But the general advice that's coming out from the powers that be, from CISA and from the experts in cybersecurity, is to use a password manager and then to aggressively rotate and manage your passwords.
Here, may I add to that?
Please.
With a password manager too, you're more likely to have a different password for every single site you need a password for, which is critical. So okay, great, they got hacked, they got into one of your sites, they're not getting into all your sites, just that one. So it really helps silo the risk.
So, hazard and threat triage, you have to prioritize your risks. What's important to you, what's not? If it can hurt you, do you care? You cannot protect yourself from everything. There is a certain level of risk that you have to be willing to accept. And you need to think about that before you're dealing with an incident. Think about what you're willing to tolerate before you're under stress. You know, science has shown that under stress, when you introduce adrenaline into a competent adult's brain, you degrade their critical thinking skills on average by a factor of 44%. And the longer you're under stress, the higher that number goes, the lower their ability to think critically goes. After 8 hours under stress, you're gonna behave as if you were blowing a .12 on a breathalyzer. Now, they did that study looking at firefighters and paramedics working 24-hour shifts. So you can extrapolate that whichever way you want. But the longer you're under stress, the lower your ability to function appropriately occurs, unless you are acclimatized to it, unless you've been exposed to stress to the point that it doesn't stress you out anymore. That works for the military, that works for first responders to a general point. I would not recommend it for nonprofits and for the general public. I absolutely do not recommend it for school children. We could have a lot of fun conversations about the best way to get kids ready for stress, but constant exposure isn't one of them. But, you know, Warren Buffett, love him or not, is a very smart man. What we learn from history is that people don't learn from history. My great-grandfather used to say that dumb people don't learn their own lessons. Smart people learn their own lessons. Wise people learn from other people's lessons. So I am hoping that I am imparting some wisdom today. You are learning from other people's lessons so that you don't have to experience the pain that they did. You know, the other line that goes with that is wisdom comes from bad decisions. So you can't just say we'll power through it. We survived COVID, we can survive anything. I did work with the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey, and their line was, we survived 9/11, we can survive anything. You can't. Things have changed. This is no longer the same world today that it was in 2020, 21, 22. It's not the same world it was yesterday. You cannot assume that because you did it yesterday, you can do it again tomorrow. You have to actively work to manage your risk. So 3 critical questions as you keep coming and carrying on. Is it possible? Can it cause disruption? Can it hurt you? How much do you care? And this is mine. This is my personal approach. There are other risk managers who will cringe and walk away. But I apply to keep it simple, stupid principle. These are the 3 simple questions when you look at risk. Could it happen? Could it hurt you? Do you care? So key steps. Once you've identified risk that you care about, you want to develop a plan. When you develop that plan, you want to do a more detailed risk assessment. You want more details on what would it take for it to happen. What can I do to mitigate that? What can I do to minimize the chance of it happening? What can I do to minimize the chance of it hurting me? What can I do to reduce the level that I care about? You want to make sure that you establish clear roles and responsibilities. What are people supposed to do? What are your expectations for them? But also, what are their expectations for your organization? So when we talk about especially human-driven threats, when we talk about insider threats, active shooters, workplace violence, there's a key phrase that comes up in the majority of the science about this, and that phrase is maladaptive organizational response. If you don't understand what's expected of you, if your employees don't understand what's expected of them, the odds are of your organization overreacting or underreacting increase. And that over or underreaction is that maladaptive or that bad response. You're looking for the Goldilocks zone, where you can respond to an appropriate level to protect your organization that doesn't cause more disruption than it prevents. You want to talk about prevent, protect, prepare. You want to learn and figure out what can you do to prevent the disruption from happening. You want to recognize that we don't live in a world of absolutes. I cannot prevent 100% of anything 100% of the time. So you want to look at this occurrence and go, how can I protect my organization when it happens, when my prevention fails? You want to look at how do you prepare your organization to deal with what you can't protect against. And then you want to be ready to respond. And responding instead of reacting is very important. Response is a considered action where you have time to take a deep breath and think about what do we need to do. If you react to something, that's reflex. You don't necessarily think about it. Now, I came out of the healthcare world, so I like to talk about react versus respond in terms of neurology and biology and the reflex loop. So if you take your hand and you put it on something that's hot, that impulse goes up your hand and goes to your spine and stops at what's known as a reflex node. And that reflex node goes, is this hurting me or not? And the answer is yes. At the same time that impulse goes up to the brain to tell you, hey, that's hot, there's another impulse going to your arm and saying, pull back. So your body is automatically reacting to protect you. Now the problem is when you pull back, you may be taking your elbow into your little child that was over next to you, or you may knock over grandma's crystal vase, or cause all sorts of other issues. So as an organization, you always want to have that considered response. Think about it before you do something. Otherwise, you may be actually causing more consequences that you didn't necessarily deal with. Communicate. You always want to talk about this. Nothing about your risk management plan should be secret unless it is a proprietary element where it being out in the public would directly hurt your organization. This falls in the lines of some security considerations, some law enforcement considerations. If you were dealing with classified or restricted data from somebody, everything else needs to be as open as you can so that the people in your organization understand what's going on. Because like I said, in a vacuum, people make up their own stories. They make their own assumptions. Then you want to think about how do you recover. And recovery can be a really touchy subject. There's a lot of people say, well, that's resilience. And I'll respectfully argue the point. Recovery isn't resilience, but once again, that's a whole other conversation. But how do you go back to normal or regular operations? You need to decide, are we going to recover back to the status quo? Or are we going to try and go back the way it was? But the way it was is what allowed this incident to happen, what allowed everything to be disrupted. Or to steal a line from a politician, do you want to build back better? Do you want to take the opportunity of the disruption to fix what made you vulnerable to that disruption in the first place? The problem is, in order to fix that, you have to acknowledge that there's a vulnerability to begin with. And that can sometimes be the biggest challenge, is getting past the ego and admitting that maybe we didn't do something right, or maybe there's a possibility to get better. So I've been talking for a long time. Had some questions and comments from that. Any other questions from the group? Please.
Kind of going back to, this is more of dealing with physical events, but you mentioned way back at the beginning, a duty of care. And I know with my experience, both as a participant in physical events and in organizing physical events, a lot of times my initial way of dealing with that risk is a waiver. You know, I have to sign a waiver in order to participate in this event. I have to sign a waiver in order to visit this facility, or you have to sign this waiver in order to participate in what I'm doing. And you know, you generally find something that's boilerplate online, use that language, make it a little specific to what you're doing in your organization, and run with it. I have, in some events that I've done, have participants come to me and say, well, I refuse to sign that waiver because it has no legal binding in your state, or has no legal, you know, really there is no legal standing to it. And so I'm wondering, what is your feedback feedback on that, or your take on that? Like, what is a waiver really doing for me?
It makes you feel better.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. Right now, the legal environment in the United States has pretty much ignores the concept of contributory negligence anymore. It used to be that if you can prove that somebody knew something was dangerous and they did it anyway and they got hurt, that they had to at least take some responsibility for their action. Current environment for civil litigation, judges don't like to apply that anymore. It's if you are the responsible party, you are the responsible party. There's no real way to share it out. And the problem with those waivers is all somebody has to do is stand up and say, I didn't read it before I signed it. I was in a rush, there was a line before me, I felt pressured that I couldn't take the time to read it, and that will invalidate any legal standing there.
So we've had events and we have a waiver and it goes out and it's like ticket purchase, but you have to bring your signed waiver with you.
Right.
Is that a form of protection at this
No.
point or no?
So what you're doing is you're mandating that somebody be informed of the activity, but legally that does not provide you any protection at all. In the case of a school, if it's like a permission slip from a parent, it's just an acknowledgement that the parent knows there's something going on, but it doesn't provide you any protection or liability. What it could do is, in some cases, it could give you permission to take action that's traditionally outside of the scope of a caregiver.
So, I mean,
So-
we do have like the medical
Yeah,
information.
this is
Same
the
form
medical
that's signed
signature
on
that
it
says
as
the
well,
nurse
right?
can give my child Tylenol.
Right.
That has some weight because it's giving permission for an action. A waiver that's saying we acknowledge that there is risk and we promise not to sue the school if little Bobby gets hurt isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. Because all the parent has to do is say, I didn't understand what I was signing, the school didn't give me the opportunity to ask questions. There are all sorts of ways around that. And in the case of a museum, you guys have an additional weight where you don't only have to deal with risk for the people, you have to deal with the cultural loss if the exhibits in your museum are damaged. And that's a whole nother school of risk and liability to look at. Please.
In this environment, I think another very common method in terms of attempting to protect organizations and certainly the types of events that go on among these organizations. Another one is photo releases, because certainly everyone uses social media, and so that's what I find. If there's one thing many of these types of organizations that may consider themselves experienced, they will use waivers or photo releases. So does the same go for a photo release?
So the photo release has weight. Photo release is giving permission for an action as opposed to removing liability for consequence. So, personally, I hate boilerplate, so I wouldn't use anything that's downloaded from the internet that your own counsel hasn't looked at, because it's generic. But I would be very sure that you know what's in your release and what's not, and that it's customized for your organization, and that you are able to explain it to somebody at an appropriate level of comprehension, so that if you do get a question, you're able to speak to it. And that means in terms of cognitive ability and level, in terms of language, in terms of cultural cues. So I've got a friend who does emergency management for Los Angeles County. Every document he writes is translated into 143 languages, because that's his body of responsibility. So how many languages are spoken in your school? How many kids are English as a second language, where their parents may not speak English at all? If you send notes to them in English, then all you're gonna get is a signature and no understanding of compliance. Gives you absolutely zero protection in court. They just had a gentleman in New York who got into an altercation with a police officer. The police officer died. Person was charged with murder, went to court, the judge threw it out because this individual was an immigrant, did not speak English, and said, in my culture, we don't listen to the cops because they're gonna hurt us. I don't speak English, I didn't understand what the cop was yelling at me, I was in fear for my life. And the judge ruled that was an appropriate defense and threw the charge out of court. So you have to think about language, you have to think about culture, you have to think about understanding and engagement. So we're over time. I absolutely respect all of your calendars, all of your time. I am more than happy to stay here for a little while longer to ask and answer questions. But I want to tell you, thank you very much for paying attention. Nobody fell asleep. Nobody got lost in their cell phone. Nobody threw anything at me. I really appreciate that one. We have flyers for 139 at the desk that have our contact information in there. This has been a very, very high level, 100,000 foot level discussion about hazards, threats, vulnerability, and risk. If you are walking out of here with more questions than answers, I'm gonna count that as a win for me, because hopefully you're gonna go do some research. You might call me and ask some questions, but hopefully you're gonna go out and investigate this a little bit more. We have a duty of care. We have a duty to take care of our organizations. We have a duty to take care of our members, take care of our customers, clients, and stakeholders. And even as nonprofits, that duty still exists. So hopefully I've shared some information that's useful today, and that this has been worth time out of your busy schedule. So thank you again.